Have you ever wondered why the holidays bring out your worst feelings, the resentment, the withdrawal, and at times even irritation? Why does being around family suddenly make your old defensive patterns flare up? The aloofness, the shutdown, or the people pleasing and forced charm? Why is it that when you are getting ready, or the moment when you actually walk into a holiday gathering, the psychological stability that you've built up all year suddenly feels precarious? Have you ever wondered, is holiday stress really about too much socializing? Or is it about being pushed out of your carefully maintained inner refuge? Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. These are a few of the questions we're going to tackle in this special holiday episode. The holidays tend to stir up what we call in my field a state of narcissistic vulnerability, a moment when your internal world feels fragile, exposed, or easily disrupted. It's the part of the personality that asks, and I quote, "Do I matter?" Or "How much do I matter? Will I be seen? Will I be heard? Or will I even be noticed?" The holidays intensify all of these questions and then add several more. Returning home, stepping back into old family dynamics, or simply navigating a higher volume of social interactions can stir up a wide range of feelings. Suddenly, you're not just attending a family dinner or a work gathering. You're being pushed outside your familiar psychological terrain, beyond the routines and internal structure that helps keeps you stable and comfortable. When you are forced, and I quote the word forced, I'll go into this in more detail momentarily, but when you're forced to step out of your comfort zone because of family and social obligations, as you can imagine, the pressure rises, the pressure to perform, to be heard, to hold everything together, to be seen in a certain way, or to avoid shame or feeling criticized. But what I want to emphasize is something more subtle and more psychologically accurate. Your old defensive patterns are being challenged. Why and how, and this is what I'm encouraging you to consider, do the very moments designed to bring people together also, and I quote again, expose the most fragile parts of your inner world? And I'll come back to that word expose in a moment. I'm focusing on exposure because the very strategies you've relied on to steady yourself, the internal places you retreat to when you feel overwhelmed, they become much harder to access. This is where things can feel especially destabilizing. Narcissistic defenses aren't only about grandiosity or entitlement. They're also about preserving a sense of safety inside oneself. For many people with narcissistic characteristics, having a protected internal world, a familiar psychic space where you can withdraw from emotional demands, is essential. It's the place where you regulate, where you restore your equilibrium, where you escape the feelings of being, again, I quote, exposed. During the holidays, that safe internal territory becomes harder to maintain. And I quote, psychic retreat, and don't worry, I'll come back and I'll describe what I mean by this concept in a moment. But the psychic retreat, the withdrawal into a private inner world to avoid external reality, gets interrupted by the sheer reality of proximity, family expectations, relational demands, work obligations, and therefore what we see is emotional intensity. This is why people with narcissistic traits can feel especially reactive during this season. It's not that they're simply being self-centered or difficult, typical labels that you may hear if you're looking into the holidays and narcissism. But what I'm suggesting is that their defensive structure, their psychic retreat, their place of safety is being intruded upon. The outside world begins pressing in, and the usual distance that you rely on starts to collapse. When that protective inner space becomes harder to access, it becomes much more difficult to hide inside the familiar refuge that typically keeps painful feelings at bay. In other words, narcissistic behavior is not just exhibitionistic or controlling. It is often a form of defensive withdrawal, a way to protect a fragile inner self that fears being seen, misunderstood, or criticized. At some point, we'll explore these painful emotions more fully, but I'll tell you now, they often also include shame and a sense of irrelevance and a profound feeling of aloneness. And yes, aloneness even when with others at these holiday gatherings. When the holidays disrupt the retreat, the person can feel exposed. And it's this exposure, not malice or selfishness, again, what you typically hear, but it's this exposure that drives much of the tension. Now, on the surface, it's not uncommon. You may see selfishness, a lack of empathy. It's not to say that these things are not true, but what I'm getting at here is what drives that type of behavior. Perhaps what you're hearing is my attempt to emphasize something more subtle, and in my experience, more psychologically accurate. Your old defensive patterns are being challenged and destabilized. When someone has narcissistic traits, there's usually a safe place, an inner zone they retreat into to restore equilibrium. For some, it's the illusion of the grandiose self, the fantasy of competence, superiority, or control. For others, it's not overt grandiosity at all. It's a psychic territory, a private internal world where they slip into when the real world feels too demanding or too exposing. In other words, narcissistic functioning isn't only about showing off. It's also about withdrawing, hiding. It's a defensive posture organized around the fear of contact. Genuine contact, that is. And this is where the work of John Steiner comes in, and it's really relevant. Steiner is a famous psychoanalyst, and he wrote extensively about, again, I quote, psychic retreats. And I find this concept incredibly useful when thinking about narcissism during the holidays. A psychic retreat is a defensive withdrawal that limits genuine emotional contact with others. It's not simply being introverted or needing space. It's an internal sanctuary built to avoid anxiety, shame, and the potential pain of needing too much or being seen too clearly. Steiner described the retreat as a place where the person becomes unreachable, insulated, and protected, but at a cost. In this retreat, you avoid other people, and importantly, you avoid reality. You avoid genuine feelings, interpersonal conflicts, disappointments, and any situation that might activate a deeper vulnerability, whatever that vulnerability might be. You could see this retreat in countless forms. In other words, it presents in many different ways. The guy who becomes obsessed with working out, dieting, and the precise number of hours he must rest, recover, and sleep. This is a retreat into bodily control. The woman who immerses herself in hours of reading, a deep commitment to her pet, or familiar old movies, a retreat into comfort and predictability. The more vulnerable narcissist who clings to one-on-one intimacy but cannot tolerate groups, a retreat into a controlled relational environment. The main point here is that in these moments you become stuck, cut off, and out of reach. But, and this is crucial, inside the psychic retreat, you are not simply hiding. You're also trying to protect a fragile internal self from becoming overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of the holidays, the expectations, the comparisons, the family dynamics, the closeness to old wounds, and the exposure to relationships that you can't easily manage or predict. Whether the retreat is idealized or persecutory, it becomes something that the person clings to as a preferable mode of functioning. In Steiner's terms, the psychic retreat serves as a protected area of the mind, a place where reality doesn't have to be faced, where fantasy remains unchecked, and where the fragile self can feel safe from scrutiny, disappointment, or emotional demands. Inside this retreat, omnipotence can exist unchallenged. One can maintain the illusion of self-sufficiency and total independence. And when the retreat is working well, and I quote well as if it can, because remember, it comes with certain consequences, but when it's working well, it can feel deceptively stabilizing. There's no friction, no emotional exposure. Nothing happens to disturb the protective bubble. Sometimes the retreat is so successful that this person experiences very little anxiety. As long as the system goes unchallenged, no one intrudes, no one demands, no one sees too much of you, and no one gets too close, not close enough at least, to activate any genuine feelings. But the cost is profound. Despite the suffering the retreat inevitably brings, the loneliness that feels both chosen and resented, the obsessive controlling preoccupation, the rumination that never leads to relief, it remains the preferred mode of psychic functioning. So what I'm pointing out is, this is the cost, right? It seems like such a safe bubble, but in it you end up feeling moments of intense loneliness. And these obsessive thoughts don't go away. That's the ruminating that I mentioned earlier. But I'm saying despite this, it's still the preferred mode of psychic functioning. So the psychic retreat becomes the, and I quote again, solution. I'm using this word loosely, but it also perpetuates the problem. It becomes the solution, but perpetuates the problem. I'm saying that twice, yes. And this is why the holidays are so destabilizing, because the problem never goes away. Family gatherings, increased closeness, and social expectations threaten the retreat. They pull you out of your safe space and into a relational reality, the very thing the retreat was designed to avoid. When closely explored, I've discovered that the internal message at times sounds something like, I can't stay hidden here. They want something from me, and they expect something that I don't think I can deliver. When the inner retreat gets challenged, the psyche can move in all kinds of directions. But to keep this simple, here are the two most common patterns that I see. Defensive intensification. You pull back harder, become more rigid, irritable, controlling, or you shut down. And 2, defensive collapse. The retreat gives way, and you feel exposed, overwhelmed, or flooded with anxiety, depression, or shame. This is where many people with narcissistic patterns misinterpret their own experience. They blame the stress of the holidays, the chaos of the gatherings, the noise, the kids, and the obligations. But what's actually being threatened is the internal structure they depend on, the psychic retreat that has kept their vulnerability at bay. The retreat was never a sign of not caring. It was a sign of protecting the fragile self, protecting against humiliation, protecting against the feeling of being unimportant, unseen, or too much, protecting against the anxiety around everyday disappointments and frustrations, and at a deeper level, protecting against the fear of fragmentation. That means falling apart, collapsing. And if and when you come out of the retreat, the fear is one of decompensation. The big problem with the holidays is now your family or the world asks for engagement, and the retreat is asked to loosen up. This is where the internal conflict now intensifies. See, before, when you were safely in your retreat, the conflict wasn't as intense. But now it intensifies because there's a demand. And this is where narcissistic defenses rise, not out of arrogance, but out of a terror of losing the only safe psychological space you have ever known. And so you go. You show up, but you don't go freely. You go feeling forced, feeling as though you've had to surrender something essential. Internally, it can feel like being pushed out of your carefully maintained rhythm, your sacred routine, your rituals of what? Self-regulation. You've been pulled away from the fortress of your safe haven, the inner place where you know exactly who you are and what keeps you nice and stable. If we play this scenario out a little bit further, can you imagine the next step? You arrive at the party or the family gathering in a state of what? Subtle depletion or heightened anxiety or heightened agitation, because you're feeling forced, by the way, right? You're already off balance when you arrive. You're already compromised, already managing an internal protest that sounds a little something like this. I don't want to be at this stupid or annoying family celebration. Or, I'm not ready for this. I shouldn't have to do this. This space is too unpredictable, too chaotic, or too demanding. You walk into the room carrying that mix of resentment, anxiety, and a little disorientation. Again, not because you don't care, but because your internal scaffolding has been disrupted. Your usual ways of maintaining your equilibrium have temporarily dismantled, and now you're required to interact, to perform, to be present, to be social, to be competent. And what happens next? Every interpersonal cue, a comment, a glance, a question, a neutral joke now lands on an unprotected self. You're more reactive, more easily injured, more prone to misinterpretation. You may feel suddenly misunderstood, criticized, unseen, not heard, not sufficiently paid attention to. I could keep going, but you get the point. These are all the things that are held at bay by the retreat. These feelings and reactions are not character flaws. They are the mind's desperate attempt to rebuild a protective shield in real time when you're actually at the gathering, at the party, with your family. Because once you feel this way, what do you do next? You may become quieter, more distant, or more controlling, or even more grandiose. And this is where the classical narcissistic defenses everyone talks about become visible. Lack of empathy, withdrawal, aloofness, forced charm, subtle hostility, or an exaggerated sense of confidence. The mind is scrambling to recreate the conditions of the retreat, conditions where you don't have to feel overwhelmed, anxious, abandoned, or exposed. And just to be very clear, yes, I'm suggesting that all of these classical narcissistic defenses that I just named can become part of the psychic retreat. But the problem is, the more you withdraw internally, the more disconnected you feel externally. And this only intensifies the sense that you don't belong there, or that you're misunderstood, or you're feeling excluded and left out, all alone. These are feelings, very painful feelings that I typically hear. This is the emotional narcissistic conflict of the holidays. And this is exactly where so much can go wrong, where misunderstandings happen, where shame flares, where envy intensifies, where small comments land like attacks, and where you can either shut down, lash out, or become overly compliant to survive the moment. We're going to pause here for today, but I hope this gave you a new way of understanding what actually happens inside of you during this season, not from a place of blame or judgment, but from compassion and curiosity. If you would like to hear more about what happens after you've been pulled out of your retreat into real contact, let me know. Shoot me a message. I can walk you through a very few common holiday scenarios so you can start recognizing the internal shifts. They're so subtle, but if we go through specific examples, I think you'll begin to see these subtle shifts that may be happening. And this way you can begin to get some control over them. Despite everything we've talked about today, the pressure, the complexity, the pressure to come out of the psychic retreat, I genuinely hope that you can find moments of relief, connection, or even small pockets of enjoyment this holiday season. Sometimes it's not about feeling good or wonderful. Sometimes it's about suffering just a little bit less, staying a little bit more present, or noticing one moment where you did not retreat. And these moments, they matter. They're signs of an internal shift already beginning to take place. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.